the last legal proceedings, it was five judges in the South African Appeals Court who overturned the decision of the original trial judge. She found Pistorius guilty of culpable homicide, and the appeal court said no, it was outright, flat murder. So, as a consequence of that, his sentence was up significantly. He was only spent about a year or so in jail after the initial verdict, but then he was handed a longer sentence. I think it was 15 years, and now he's being released after 8.5.
So you covered the trial extensively, and even mid-trial, you went to meet Pistorius and interviewed him. How did you find him as a person at that time? What did you talk about specifically? Where did you talk? And what impression did he leave on you?
Yeah, well, I'd been watching the trial, and I was in the courtroom for pretty much every day the trial lasted, and he cut a pretty sorry figure. He would regularly vomit into this plastic bucket by his side, and when his turn came to testify, he would howl and weep. He would actually howl and weep even when he was listening to other people giving their testimony. So I was not surprised that the first impression, I met him at the home of his uncle Arnold, where he was staying in Pretoria. My first impression was of someone who was really rather meek, and he almost came across as a kind of guilty schoolboy in his manner. He was very polite. He said, very pleased to meet you, Mr. Carlin. But very quickly, he sort of changed into a completely different mode and started relating to me as if we were old buddies. And he said, why don't we go and grab an Italian? And so, to my surprise, I found myself in a car with this accused murderer driving down the road from his uncle's home to a local Italian restaurant, where we proceeded to have a very easygoing chat in which he said that this restaurant was one that he and Reeva Steenkamp, his girlfriend who he killed, used to go and eat at. He told me a couple of dishes that Reeva enjoyed. The linguine was something that particularly appealed to Reeva. And then he started talking about other restaurants that he and Reeva used to go to around the country. And it was all just very, very relaxed and very easy. And in fact, and surprisingly, even though the restaurant was full, most people didn't seem to pay much attention to us. But then the most interesting thing was after lunch, we returned to his Uncle Arnold's home, and we went to this cottage, they call it, a sort of kind of suite that he had within the grounds of his uncle's big home. His uncle's a very rich man. And we went in through the door, and the first thing I saw, to my astonishment, on a wall facing me over a mantelpiece, was a picture of Reeva Steenkamp, quite a well-known photograph of hers, looking very sort of bewitching and, supermodel-ish. And underneath the framed photograph on the wall, on the mantelpiece, a lit candle. He didn't offer any explanation, and I just sort of let it go. And then we sat down on a sort of couch, and he started rifling through these photo albums and showing me pictures of him and Reeva together, apparently very much in love, smiling to the cameras in gorgeous settings on mountaintops, on beaches and so forth. And that was how the whole thing ended. Now, clearly what he was doing, because he's not a sort of stupid man, he knew I was doing a book about him, about this whole case, and I was following the trial as a journalist. And I think clearly he was trying to convince me that he and Reeva had been very much in love, and that therefore the notion that he had deliberately killed her, which is what the prosecution in the trial was seeking to prove, was ridiculous. Now, aware of the fact that I was being to some degree manipulated, I was obviously skeptical and didn't really form any judgment. But overall, I'd say, in terms of the impression that he caused on me as a man, it confirmed what I heard from lots of other people who'd met him and been close to him, that he's actually, a nice, easygoing, pretty kind kind of chap. And I think most notably, I'd mention a couple of people of Black Paralympic athletes who were sort of junior to him in the South African Paralympic team, who kind of worshipped him because he was a national hero. After Nelson Mandela, he was the greatest national hero across all racial lines. And these young, black Paralympic athletes. One of them I remember particularly had no arms below the elbow. They worshipped him, and they didn't only worship him, they actually liked him because he said that he was very kind and attentive to them and helped them in their athletic, development. So all in all, the picture that I formed of him spending time with him, 3 hours or so in mid-trial, and from many people who knew him well, was of someone for whom killing somebody, especially his beloved, was, out of character, to say the least.
In terms of what he actually did, how convinced are you now, looking back, that he killed Riva deliberately versus an accident or the intruder theory that was posited?
Well, you have no idea how many times I've been asked this question. And my answer is always the same, that I cannot categorically state, and nor can anybody, that he deliberately, knowingly killed Riva Steenkamp, that he knew Riva Steenkamp, his girlfriend, was behind that bathroom door. The prosecution in the trial tried extremely hard to prove that argument, and they actually had the finest homicide detective in South Africa. And in South Africa, detectives know about homicide, trust me. And they were unable to establish a motive. That was the thing. I mean, there was tons of speculation before and during the trial that, that Pistorius had responded to her in some kind of a jealous rage, that maybe he'd suddenly discovered that she had some other lover. But that was never proved. The idea that they had some kind of row and he chased her into the bathroom, she locked herself in, then he fired the bullets. That was the idea the prosecution sought to implant in the judge, in the mind of the judge. Now, there was not enough evidence to convince the judge, and neither was there enough evidence to convince the 5 appeal court judges. Interestingly, by the way, the trial judge was a black woman, and the 5 appeal court judges were 5 white men. I mentioned that as an anecdotal fact. But the thing is that it was never established at all, categorically. There was never any sufficient evidence to say that he had deliberately killed her. So in the end, what the appeal courts judged, what they ruled, was that in firing 4 bullets through that bathroom door, he must have known there was a very high chance that he was going to kill the person behind. But they were not able to prove that Pistorius was aware of who that person, who that someone was. So therefore, he fired with an intention to kill, was the final appeal court verdict, and that's what he was jailed for. But it was never established that he fired with the intention to kill Riva Steenkamp.
So what will he do now? Where will he go? How much danger is he potentially in? Because there will be people out there who see him as a target. What do you think are his next moves?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that there will be people who are going to be very annoyed by the decision to release him. I think a lot of people would have wanted him to just spend the rest of his life in jail and the key be thrown away. In fact, social media statistics around the world showed that there was a significant majority of people who absolutely convinced themselves that he had deliberately killed her. So, yes, he will be wary. And I think for that reason, but also for personal reasons, my strong suspicion, knowing him somewhat and knowing his family well, is that he's going to lie low. He's going to retreat into some kind of a private dimension. What exactly he's going to do with the rest of his life? He's not going to run again, that's for sure. Certainly not competitively. He may do something like, which I discussed once with his uncle. He might sort of seek to atone for what he did by spending time with landmine victims in 2 neighboring countries, Angola and Mozambique, where there's been landmine victims, plenty of people who've lost their legs. He might perhaps act as some kind of a coach for other younger Paralympic athletes. I don't know, but I think that it's highly unlikely that we're going to see a whole slew of TV interviews with him explaining his version of the story. I think for all kinds of reasons, personal, for his own mental health, and indeed for his own physical health, because who knows, there might be someone out to get him. I think he'd better keep pretty low.
In terms of that explanation, how much remorse do you think he has shown, if not for just the fact that he killed somebody, in his opinion, accidentally. How much remorse has he shown for the death of Reva, and what about her family? How do they feel about the case right now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the reasons why the original trial judge gave him a rather more lenient verdict and sentence than the prosecution asked was that she was absolutely convinced at the sincerity of the remorse that he showed. I mean, he was, there were just scenes of absolute sort of they were harrowing to watch in the courtroom sometimes. The guy was really sort of howling, falling apart. And unless he was a sort of fantastic actor, I think it had to be for real. Now, of course, the question is his remorse that some people will have at having killed Reva or having landed himself in this appalling predicament by having killed her? I mean, my strong sense is that whatever happened that night, whether there was some fit of anger, some rage, some row, which we have no reason to believe there was, we don't know, but that he does definitely feel utterly remorseful about having done this and having killed Reva Steenkamp, and wishes to God it had never happened. I mean, I think of that we can be pretty damn sure. In terms of the family, they have been, very understandably seeking retribution. I mean, I think, if I'd been the father of Reva Steenkamp, I mean, I'd want to have the maximum punishment inflicted on this guy. And inevitably, their view is not going to be the most objective or balanced on this. And they definitely have not been happy about his release. They actually managed to push back his release because he could have been released about a year ago. And the father has died. By the way, the father has died. The mother is still there, and I imagine that she's probably going to be talking in the next few days and expressing her distress about this. But ultimately, a judgment like this cannot be made, in legal fairness in terms of the feelings of the victim, however genuine and however much they suffered, but in terms of a more cold-blooded court system, which is what happened. Millions and millions of people really got engaged with this story. It was a massive story when it broke at the time, international story. Millions of people watched the trial live on TV, and the majority, by all statistical indications, really believed, and still believe probably, that he deliberately killed Reva Steenkamp. Now, which to me is fascinating as someone who was there watching it very close up. I can't reach that judgment. I can't reach a judgment either way, which tells me something about the way that human minds work. Imagine this: if instead of the person who was killed being Reva Steenkamp, his beautiful model girlfriend, it had been his wife or his sister, and had all the circumstances otherwise been the same, then it's highly likely that public opinion would have been different on this, and people would be much more disposed to believe his version of events, that it was a tragic accident. But because it fell into this sort of narrative of, the gorgeous girl, the sort of Othello, Desdemona kind of idea that we're all kind of, I think, in many ways programmed to have in our minds, there was this weight of public opinion against him, and prepared, firmly to believe that he knowingly killed. I'll just mention just very briefly one thing which is fascinating, which I didn't know about when I wrote the book, which frustrates me immensely. But 2 years before Oscar Pistorius shot dead his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp, there was an incredibly similar case in elsewhere in South Africa, where a preacher, a black preacher, about 37 years old, killed his wife in almost identical circumstances. In the middle of the night, he heard a noise in the bathroom. He grabbed his gun from his bedside table. He ran to the bathroom. He fired a shot through the door, and he killed his wife. Now, this guy never went to trial. A deal was reached with the prosecution of culpable homicide, suspended sentence. He never saw a day in jail. And because the assumption absolutely was that, he couldn't possibly have deliberately killed his wife, even though the circumstances were uncannily similar. So I find that interesting in terms of what it says about the way that our minds work in response to an incident like this one, how we immediately fit it into a kind of narrative that we think we're already familiar with.